We started developing these materials, and also we distributed to the campesinos, anybody. We distribute through organizations also to educate what does mean the COVID-19, how to protect yourself. And it's basically an educational material, and also how important it's the vaccine, and also your rights during the pandemic, because I saw lots of violation of worker rights locally. And I think lots of happen in different places, but just locally I saw that. No, the distance, the 16 feet or 15, 16 distance, the workers are working together, and many people will get sick, and some of them died because the rancheros didn't care about that. And then also other organizations work also to pass, how do you say that, in the legislation to push the rancheros to do something. And also when we went to the farm workers, other organizations also joined us as AFSC, like Mano a Mano and Latinos Unidos Siempre, and they brought food. And then a big caravan went to the farms, and some farms said, just leave the stuff in here. We're gonna give them later. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to see the workers. We wanted to talk to them. And some rancheros didn't allow us to do that. And what we did is we wait the people outside when they get off work, and on the street or on the highway, waiting for the workers. And that's the way how we made this contact with them. That's one thing. We were working on that when the wildfire started. Many people displaced, you knew that. And another thing, what we should do now. Looks like our rapid response team didn't work on we responded. As a rapid response team, this is the way how we responded. And we also collected food, clothes, and items for the families displaced from the areas where the wildfire affected. And we went to Phoenix, Oregon, where some of them, people left their houses basically without nothing, just the clothes they wear. And lots of things happening, and we feel like we didn't have we need more support. We talked to the Guatemalan consulate if they can help us, because many people lost their documentation. And the consulate came to Phoenix, and they said the passport costs $75. And then you have to go to Seattle to pick it up.
Oh my God.
The people, no, they don't have money. They don't have food. They don't have anything. Some of them, they don't have a car because of the wildfire. And I asked the consul if why we have to pay this, because I thought we called you because we wanted you to help our community, lots of Guatemalans here, and also the Mexican consulate to see how they can help their people. But no response of that. They said that's what I received and I have to do it. And then the community collect money to pay for the passport and pick it up the passports in Seattle. That's an experience we have. And I asked them if, let's say if the US, a US person like in some part of the world, I think the embassy, that's what I think. The embassy gonna help their people to see how to come back, not see how much I can make on this person. Yeah, and then, but unfortunately, our government is that the reality. And then we were working on this, the pandemic, the wildfire, and then start the storm. Remember that, the storm. We visited the same farms with the same consequences of the issue. And we had to do a workshop with them on the field, what their needs are, and also about their rights as during the pandemic, during the everything. I think that's a brief part of how we did AFSC and other organizations responded to the was it 1920, right? Yeah. Yeah, and that's basically, but one of the things we are doing for years is developing the rapid response team in different communities. The rapid response team, it's like a PIRC in Portland. It's to organize the community, non-immigrant community. Some are immigrants in this community. It's to see how they can respond to ICE presence in the community. And that's basically, that's the training we have done with them. But then during this time, it was different to respond. That's a new learning for us. We didn't have this in our programs. We have to change it. We have to switch it. We have to adapt ourselves to the crisis to see how we can support our community. I think that's all.
Thank you, Pedro. That's really good information for all of us to know. And before we start with Pat, does anyone have questions for Pedro? You can just unmute. Okay.
Looks like not. And
sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself and text at the same time. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Pedro. That is incredibly powerful. What you were doing and what was happening in the farm worker communities and migrant communities throughout that part of Oregon during the pandemic, the fires, the storms, all the different layers of inequity. To really get those details clearly laid out is so important and helpful for other folks in Oregon and the world to understand just what the impact of the pandemic has been like for people. I'm wondering, are there continuing needs for people who have been not just impacted by loss of wages during the pandemic or unfair working conditions, but that are still dealing with displacement from homes or temporary homes? Are people still struggling with housing, food, healthcare?
yes, yes, we're gonna have a meeting in the next couple of weeks to see how we're gonna respond it during the summer, because the people still affected. And yeah, we're gonna work on that, coordinate with other organizations also to see how we're gonna respond it. But AFSC mostly focuses on education, like developing materials of popular education to understand the issue. And that's what we're gonna do. The other thing we helped, it's we helped with the how do you call this, Oregon the economical support, give it to the farm workers, our how to say, Oregon
Farm worker relief.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's the right title. I know it was a long title.
Yeah, that's basically that. And also we helped with that. And as AFSC and as Pedro, also we went to do outreach with the Quiche speaking community. And we realized that many indigenous community left out. And hope if there is another round of support, we are gonna try to reach out the indigenous communities, because my experience when I got a receive from a call from Quiche speaking, even in Quiche, it's hard because in the Quiche in Guatemala and different regions, it's some difference. I think it's like in the US, the English in Houston, in Texas is different than here. And that's what happened with Quiche also. It was hard. They don't speak Spanish, they don't speak English. And it was hard for them to process the help, but we did it. And that's what I see lots of indigenous community needs help. And we're gonna continue to do that. We have a group of indigenous community to also to help in this. We are helping also to do interpretation. I have done lots of interpretation in Quiche to Spanish to help the people. Sometimes they come to the clinic, it's no communication. And I see also some issues. I saw some people in the Oregon State Hospital. They called me for interpretation in Quiche. And basically, this is not to do with wildfire or the issues I mentioned, but this is a different thing because they didn't speak Spanish, English, and they thought that they were have some mental issue. And they sent it to the hospital. When I asked them why you are here, I don't know. And that's the issue we have seen with our community, indigenous especially. This is just the Quiche speaking, but a lot of other languages that I don't have access.
Pedro, maybe if you could put in the chat your contact information and the Facebook page for AFSC Project Voice, so that if people want to be able to follow up with you on some of this, is that something you can do or we can do later, Nan, to just send that out to people?
Yes,
Okay.
we can follow up too. But yes, it'd be great to put it in the chat.
Okay, maybe okay, thank you. Maybe I'm taking more time, but I wanted to introduce also my longtime friend, Patricia Runner. And she is being part of the work of AFSC. Currently, she is the member of the executive committee for the international programs. She was the executive committee also for the West Coast AFSC. She worked closely with me in the program. I know that she's been doing lots of work, and I'm proud to introduce her. Bienvenida, Pat.
Gracias, Pedro. Gracias. And possibly, Nan, when we take a break you can go ahead and introduce Veronica also, who is
Yes.
part. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Pedro. I think that your introduction really puts in perspective a lot of what I'm going to say about my life as an activist. And it's deeply and heart-wise connected to Guatemala. And so I'll just tell you what I'm going to do this morning. And because we're a small group and I really want to emphasize a conversation, and that's part of the reason for asking Veronica to be part of that, is to encourage us to really talk about with each other some of these, not only issues, but how we as people called to be activists can respond and get involved. I want to begin by also thanking PCASC for this opportunity to reflect on my life as an activist. I think it was on the announcement that I have also written a book, and I want to start by saying why the book. And I most recently, until my active retirement, or as a friend refers to it as our encore years, taught capstones at Portland State University with a focus on international development, and particularly the role of women in international economic development. And during one of my classes, we really got into a very heavy duty political discussion. And I'm a former political science undergrad major. And one of the lessons I learned early on from a professor was to understand the world, you need to know who gets what, when, where, and how. Simple question. And I got real pushback from some of my students who said, "Oh, Professor Rumor, you sound so political. Not everything in this world is political." Well, that really got me. And I said, the sooner you learn that no matter where you work or what you do, it's political. It doesn't matter whether it's the church, whether it's a higher education, whether it's schools, it really has to do with the distribution of power. And I'm kind of going on and on. And one of the students held up their hand and he said to me, "Professor Rumor, you sound like a 60s radical." And I, without thinking, monitoring language, shot back, "Damn sure right. I'm so proud of being a 60s radical." Because I, like perhaps some of you on this call, grew up in the 60s and was deeply affected by the civil rights movement, by the anti-war movement, by the feminist movement, and then the gay, lesbian, transgendered, bisexual movements. Change and revolution seem to be in the air. So the follow-up question from this student was, but how do you sustain yourself? How do you keep going as an activist? And I just smiled and I said, well, this would take a lifetime to explain. So what I'm going to attempt to do in a very short, abbreviated version is give you kind of 3 highlights in my life, which really opened the doors for me to be much more conscious about being an activist. And I will start with Guatemala. And my husband, Carlos Pizito, and I went to Guatemala in 1969 as community development volunteers through the American Friends Service Committee. And that began a lifelong involvement with AFSC, which continues to this day. And many of you probably are familiar with the history of Guatemala, so I'm not going to do a history lesson, but just suffice it to say that some of the things I learned in Guatemala have changed my life and led me much more consciously into life as an activist. Some of you may be aware of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator who was so instrumental in the whole concept of conscientization or critical consciousness, and his work in working with not only the government of Brazil, but many other governments, and the formation of the kind of critical literacy work that was done throughout Latin America. So when I arrived in Guatemala, I had a master's degree in political science. I thought I was fairly well educated, friends. Well, eye-openers, you know, because one of the orientations given by a person in Guatemala was talking about the 1954 coup, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. And he talked about the fact that not only was the CIA directly involved in selecting the person who became the military president. But US planes actually strafed Guatemala City in support of the overthrow of the democratically elected president, something supposedly we in the United States want to see, democratically elected presidents, not coups. And I was shocked. Maybe I was just too naive at that point, but I thought, you know, my history books never taught me that. So that was kind of the beginning of understanding that where you sit in the world and what you've experienced gives a very different interpretation or insight as to what's going on. We ended up working in a rural indigenous community, not far from where Pedro Sosa came from. We were living north of Quetzaltenango in a small indigenous community of Quiche speaking, but we also chose to work with Ladinos. And if any of you know Guatemala, the indigenous are people who have kept their culture, their language, their traditions, their dress, etc. And Ladinos refer to people who, whether they are mixed race, mestizos in Mexico, or are just more or less direct descendants of Spanish conquerors, they see themselves as Spanish speakers. And Ladinos disrespect indigenous. I saw a lot of racism and oppression because of the fact that the indigenous get the poorest paid jobs, have to, in order to survive, go to the coast and pick coffee. If they live in the highlands, because their crops do not produce enough to feed the family, etc. I think a good example of that is that a town north of San Francisco La Union, which is on the Altiplano above Quetzaltenango. When we arrived in '69, there was just a big thing about the fact that two Maryknoll priests, the Melville brothers and a Maryknoll sister, were expelled from the country because of, quote, helping the guerrilla forces, which were just beginning to organize at that point in terms of armed opposition. And what was the crime that Tom Melville was evicted from or deported from Guatemala? He had worked in a indigenous community north of where we were living. And he had noticed that the Ladinos controlled the limestone business, and it was very profitable, and they had the trucks. So he organized with others the indigenous community into a limestone cooperative. They bought a truck, and they soon began to compete with the Ladinos, who had the monopoly up until that point. So that was it, you know, out he went. And so there were time after time an example like that, in which helped open my eyes. And when I came back to the United States in the early 70s, I was just determined to educate the people in the US about what was really going on in Guatemala, and to help them become more critical of the role our government has played over the years in destabilizing Guatemala, as well as other countries, not only in Central America, South America, and other parts of the world. 10 years later, and I should say my daughter, Deborah, is on the call, and she was born in 1972 after we came back from Guatemala. I tell her she is Guatemala in her heart and soul, although she was not born in Guatemala. Fast forward 10 years, in 1982, I really wanted to get re-involved in much more visible ways. I was part of PCASC during the 70s, you know, celebrated with the revolution in Nicaragua, had hopes for the small revolution in El Salvador, and of course, really became increasingly concerned about what was going on in Guatemala with the military regime of Rios Montt. So in the 1980s, I moved to New York, and I went to work for a church, a liberal Protestant church, in doing development work, and had the opportunity to travel to Guatemala in 1983. And during that time, one could not leave the capital. It was not safe. And I was staying in a hotel in the central part of Guatemala, actually the hotel where Rios Montt and many of his Pentecostal church members attended. I figured that was the safest place to be. And a Maryknoll nun came and met me. And we talked in the bathroom of this hotel with the shower running, because she was extremely nervous about what she was about to tell me, which is that she was working in the northern part of Guatemala, to which I could not travel. But she brought the word, so to speak, that I was a trusted emissary and that I could take back what was going on, which is where I first heard about the persecution of indigenous people by the military, the forced displacement of indigenous people into what they call development villages, which were controlled by the military. And what I was asked time and time again by people I met with throughout the region was, go home and tell your fellow citizens what's going on. And I already knew from my experience from there 10 years earlier that what people were reading was not, for the most part, Karl Marx, which Ronald Reagan would have you believe. They were reading the Bible. They were reading other liberating texts, and they were working with the Paulo Freire consciousness raising and the formation of base Christian communities. And I thought, hell, what they're doing is reading the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament with its focus on justice. And they're having their consciousnesses raised through learning how to read and write, and they're organizing. That's what they're doing, which is something that we respect supposedly in the United States of America. Anyway, that led me to get involved with the sanctuary movement in the 1980s. And I was living in New York City, member of Riverside Church, which is a well-known liberal bastion on the Upper West Side of New York. And we took a Guatemalan family and their young son, and I became once again aware of, through Ana and Federico's stories, as to what was really happening. And it wasn't reaching the news in the United States, which was dominated by Ronald Reagan and some of his cadre saying, no, it's Marxist takeover and they're going to be marching to Brownsville. And the racism of saying all those brown people are going to come pouring across the border, etc. So I set about with many, many others. This is one of the things I want to lift up as a lesson, collaboration, that there were over 200 solidarity groups working during the 80s to stop the Reagan administration's invasion of Central America, to provide alternative news sources, to bring people from Central America to meet US citizens and get them involved, to contact their members of Congress, etc. It was a very, I would say, heady time. And I'm sure that those of you who were active in PCASC at that time remember how much we were working to try to change the US policy. And that included also the policy of accepting people fleeing violence in Central America in the 80s. So I wrote the book primarily because I've written a longer book, but with the more recent immigration challenges that we have faced and on the nightly news and people's lives, etc., I thought, I know a lot about why people have fled Guatemala as well as elsewhere in Central America. And a good friend of mine said, Pat, you've got to tell the story. And that has something to do with being a white woman, hopefully an ally and someone who accompanies people who are immigrants. So I set about writing this book, and I'm going to read a brief excerpt from a visit to Guatemala in 2003, which exemplifies part of what was going on in the 80s in Guatemala. This was a visit to the Ixcan, which is in kind of north central Guatemala toward the Petén, if you've been to Guatemala or have an idea of where this might be. This is entitled Sacred Land, Sagrada Tierra. It's another hot, humid day in the Ixcan, a remote area in northern Guatemala. Manuel guides members of our delegation silently through the jungle to the killing fields in his pueblo, Santa Maria Ceja. When we reach the place of the 1982 massacre, Manuel's eyes fill with tears. Slowly, he tells his story. I was working on my parcel of land some distance from the village. My infant son was crying, and my wife asked me to return to the village for milk and food. My 6-year-old son, Edwin, and I went quickly down the path to the village. On our return, we heard gunfire and ran towards our parcela or farming plot. Then only silence and the pitiful cries of the baby. Manuel falters in telling this story of the brutal slaying of his wife, 4 children, mother, and 2 cousins. Why were they killed, he asks. We are humbled by this simple, direct question about a tragic period in Guatemala's long history of violence and death. Who knows why Manuel's family was killed? Certainly it was part of Reyes Mont's scorched earth policy to root out the guerrillas and protect the civilian population. This policy, named fusiles y frijoles, or rifles and beans, meant that those villages had to make a choice, either for the government or against it. If villagers joined the government campaign against the people, they were given beans. If they opposed the government and the military, even passively, they were shot by rifles and killed. Manuel did not know why their village was singled out. Was it because of their progressive priest, Father Luis, or the trained catechists who had studied the Bible from a liberating perspective, or the fact that their cooperative had capable leaders? The scorched earth policy targeted catechists, teachers, agricultural cooperative leaders, health workers. In fact, anyone who could and did educate and organize the community. War is not the answer, Manuel tells us. The Guatemalan Civil War brought us only dolor, pobreza y miseria, sadness, poverty, and misery. People think that nothing will happen in a war, but that's not true. Manuel fled Guatemala for Mexico, where he and his new family lived until their return in 1994. We stand in this sacred place. Tears fall from our eyes as we mourn the terrible losses Manuel, his family, and so many other Guatemalans have suffered. Manuel speaks with hope about a legal case against General Reyes Mont that he and other returnees have filed with help from the Center for Human Rights Legal Action in Guatemala. 10 years later, 2013, Manuel wrote, "Our war experience has shown us that many families suffered massacres, but in almost every case, there was always a survivor. And here with us, my son Edwin got out alive. He escaped from death. Even back in 1982, I believed he would be called to do something special in his future. He's now involved in the genocide case. That 6-year-old boy, Edwin Canil, is a witness to the massacre and a lawyer with the legal center that co-prosecuted Reyes Mont. And although the genocide decision was overturned, Edwin believes that the decision is important so that events like these can never again be repeated." Edwin is a lawyer and actually during the case was in the courtroom with Reyes Mont, and I would love to have been there to see that. He's quite an amazing young man. You take a breath. I think part of what my activism has been fueled by is the constant recognition that I and my fellow citizens of the United States of America, and even those who are not, but residents of the United States, are culpable, we're guilty, we're responsible for a lot of what I've been describing. And so years later, when I was in Guatemala, somebody said to me, "Well, you love Guatemala so much, Pat, why didn't you stay?" I said, "Because the work's not here in Guatemala. Sure, there are elites, sure, there are the military, but the real work is in the United States of America, which is sending the money and providing the support." So in the last 20, 25 years, a lot of my work has been focused locally, nationally, and internationally in trying to help people understand the root causes of migration, not just from Central Americans, but worldwide, from Africa to Europe, from the Middle East to Europe, from all the places in the world where people are fleeing violence. In 2014, I went back to Guatemala for an extended period of time to really begin to work on a memoir to tell that story of activism. And while I was there, I visited with a old friend in Quetzaltenango, the second largest city in Guatemala in the north. And in talking with her, a school teacher, and some of her fellow teachers, I was just horrified to hear them talk about how the drug cartels are actively recruiting students in schools in Guatemala. And that the going price for entry into a drug gang is $50 US, which means they have to kill someone, and the cartels supply the money. And if you're a woman, you're raped. Well, I thought, well, nothing could shock me anymore, right, in life? But it did. And it just angered me, absolutely angered me that such a situation has come about for a variety of political and economic reasons in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. That, as I say to people when I explain about migration and root causes, if you were the mother of a young son or a daughter, and you knew what the consequences were if your son or daughter refused to become part of the drug cartel, what would you do? You do what a lot of them are doing, which is put their child on a bus or find a family traveling north and get them to safety. And so that's how I became involved after 2014. And I came home to Portland to just have that summer be when President Obama talks about, the invasion or the waves of young adults fleeing violence in Central America. And what was the answer? Lock them up, put them in detention centers. Well, I was outraged. I hope some of you were outraged and attended the rallies in downtown Portland and wrote letters and talked to your congressmen and senators, et cetera. And I was so frustrated by my own government's incapacity to respond in a humane way that a good friend said to me, well, why don't you do something about it, Pat? And so I went to the Arizona-US border and became involved with humanitarian organizations that were receiving recently arrived immigrants, and to hear their stories and to try to provide some assistance to help them on their way. It was a time when the Border Patrol was releasing people who had family members in the United States. And so I was in a shelter which helped people get their bus tickets and get on their way to their family members. I also had the opportunity to visit women in the Eloy, Arizona Detention Center. And in 2016, my daughter and I had the opportunity to travel to Guatemala because what I wanted to do was really go and learn more about what Guatemala was doing, what was happening on the ground in Guatemala in terms of people making the painful decision to head north. So the second excerpt I'm going to read is from a chapter in my book called Crossing Borders. And I think you've all seen the copy of the book, and it is available on my website, and I'll put that up on the chat. Okay, Crossing Borders, and then we're going to move into question answers and conversation. As a US citizen and a white middle-class woman, I've had the privilege of crossing many borders. I've never been stopped by a customs official, nor detained in a government-operated center. I've traveled to the Middle East, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. My US passport has opened the door for me. I'm very aware of my travel privilege. After my 5 months working in Arizona, listening to the stories of recently arrived immigrants and the reasons why they migrated, I had the opportunity to visit the same Guatemalan rural community, Santa Maria Ceja, that has actually invested in its youth. I wanted the students' perspective on migration. My friend Juana, this social studies teacher of the middle school, introduced me. Imagine the scene. The classroom is in an old wood building and has one fan that slowly circulates warm air. It's the last class of the day and the students are tired. There are 15 eighth graders, 12 and 13 years of age, and it's awkward at first. I ask if someone can draw a map of Guatemala, Mexico, and the US on the whiteboard. The point of the map is to understand borders. Did you know that there was no border between Chiapas, Mexico and Guatemala until the late 1800s? Mayan people could move freely north and south. Then a border was drawn to divide Mexico from Guatemala. I continue. And Mexico used to extend up the west coast to the state of Oregon and included much of the southwest region of the United States until the Mexican-American War. Borders were again withdrawn. I turn to the class and say, how many of you have family members in the United States? Hands shoot up. Who are they? Where do they live? And what do they do? About a third of the class has family living in the North. A young woman, maybe 13 years of age, sitting in the back row says quietly, mi madre. I blurt out, how sad, and ask, where does your mother live? She shakes her head slowly. Only one of the 9 students knows where his family member lives. Why do people migrate? I ask. A small boy with laughing eyes holds up his hand with the universal gesture meaning money. There's a murmur of assent around the room. Behind this answer are the questions. Why do we have to migrate to find work? Why are there no jobs in Guatemala that can support a family? I share a little about my work on the border and the challenges migrants face upon entering the US. Then I ask, what questions do you have for me, a visitor from the North? Their questions range from why are there borders to why doesn't the US president like migrants? One boy asks, why do Americans hate us? I stammer a bit as I say, well, the drug gangs that plague your country, Honduras and El Salvador, are not only scary to you, but to the people in the United States. The president tries to paint all immigrants as criminals. He also says that immigrants are coming to take people's jobs. In reality, the jobs that most immigrants do, many North Americans won't do. In the village, life will be pretty bleak for the graduates who can't continue their education. They'll earn about $30 a month if they work on their family farm. This is after completing middle school. This is a good middle school where students study current affairs and learn English, as well as Spanish and Quiche, their Mayan language. Most of them want to continue their education, but that takes money and there's no high school nearby. There are some scholarships, but not all families can afford the costs of room and board. If there are neither jobs nor educational opportunities at home, then the dangers of the trip north do not appear so difficult to them. Are there alternatives for young Guatemalans not to migrate, but to develop a strong future at home? At a regional assembly, I hear a litany of human rights challenges in Guatemala. A local indigenous leader denounces a long list of multinational mega projects that do not benefit the community. All the speakers attack the Alliance for Prosperity, the plan proposed by the Obama administration in 2015 to help the 3 governments of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Its stated purpose, stop migration and strengthen economic development. But as one speaker observes, it's an industrial development model. Multinationals will build factories from east to west in Guatemala, but who benefits? Certainly not the local Guatemalans who will work for low wages. The students know about a multinational company's plans to build a large dam on the nearby Chishoy River that would displace more farmers by flooding their farmlands, let alone fair trade agreements. The underlying causes of migrations are big ones for 9th graders to tackle and to get their heads around. No healthcare, unemployment, lack of respect for human rights, and omnipresent violence. Attending this assembly felt surreal. In the United States, the United States thinks the migrants are the problem. But in Guatemala, the United States is perceived to be the problem because of our government's actions during the 1980s and into the present. Guatemalans know that the US government under President Reagan in the 1980s supplied arms and training to the dictator Efraín Reyes Montt, his friend. The resulting civil war killed approximately 200,000 civilians and more than 2 million Guatemalans were displaced, which led to the first wave of migration from Guatemala into the US in the 1980s, as people fled the violence of the war and sought sanctuary in the US. The view from the South is different from that in the North. Guatemalans fear the loss of an entire generation to migration. They are trying to educate, motivate, and challenge youth to take responsibility for the future of their country. In the US, we don't want more immigrants from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, let alone anyplace else. Yet, the United States has been deeply involved in the destabilization of these three countries for many decades. My own journey to Guatemala began in 1969, where I learned about Colonel Carlos Manuel Arana Osorio, a right-wing military officer referred to as the Butcher of Zacapa. In 1966, he began a military campaign with guidance and training from the US Army's Green Berets against small farmers, resulting in several thousand deaths. The farmers wanted land reform and access to title the lands they were working. It was an eye-opening experience and one that led me on my activist journey. And by the way, Carlos Arana Osorio became president in 1970, which led to a state of siege during the remaining year and a half we lived in Guatemala. So let me stop there. I've prepared, and I think Veronica will ask me for some questions about this, but I've prepared kind of a list of lessons I've learned as an activist, which I think probably many of you, if you were asked, would also have on there. And I'll just start with resistance and persistence. I almost titled the book that, because that's what I saw when I went to Guatemala and all my travels around the world, is that people organize when there is injustice and they persist. And one of the gifts that Central Americans in particular gave me, but other parts of the world, is the fact for us as activists is to always remember to celebrate, no matter how small the victory. Throw a party, have a fiesta, celebrate that, and look upon these as building blocks for the long-term struggle. I think it's something, I'm fairly serious sometimes, I forget, which is that it is really important as a community of activists to remember to celebrate. So let me end on that note and turn it over to Veronica. Maybe Nan, you want to say a few words about Veronica before we begin the next section.
Yes, okay. Thanks so much, Pat. Very inspiring. So Veronica Dujon is going to join Pat now. Veronica is currently the Director for Academic Policy and Authorization at the Oregon Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And she's also the chair of the Workers' Rights Board Organizing Committee, a project of Oregon Jobs with Justice. Veronica is a longtime colleague, collaborator, and friend of Pat. Welcome, Veronica.
Thank you, Nan. Pat, I've known you this long, so long, and every time I hear your story, it's extremely inspiring, even as it is distressing. And just listening to you today talk, capturing the purpose for writing the book, the experiences that brought you to where you are and where you have been for a long time, it really makes explicit the need for citizen-to-citizen contact.
Mm-hmm.
And especially for citizens in the United States who have the privilege of a country that is pretty powerful on a global scene, to really understand what the United States does outside of its borders, how the United States relates to other countries, and to really understand the need to know history.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we don't know history, we are very likely to end up in a black and white world with simple explanations.
Mm-hmm.
Guatemalans or Salvadorans or Mexicans are coming to the United States because they're bad people or their governments have failed. There is no attempt in current US media and communities to understand the why of it, to ask the question, why is this happening? And the assumption is these countries weren't able to manage their affairs. And that's why if we give them enough jobs and encourage investment, then it will fix the migration problem. You commented about the complicity of US citizens in what's happening or in what happened and continues to happen in Central America. And it is a complicity that is born out of ignorance in some cases, in many cases. And so I think of your book and the work that you do as a much more superior ambassador for American people than any of the officials who are appointed and represent what the government might want to communicate, but not what citizens in Guatemala experience, nor what citizens in the United States should know. So your book and capturing your experience is extremely welcome, well-timed, and I am glad that your story is getting out there and you're putting it out there, and I hope many people read it. I wanted to ask you, in the work that you have done and you continue to do, the question about what sustains you. What has sustained you over that many years and continues to inspire you? How might you answer that? And I ask that question because as activists, we sometimes feel overwhelmed or question whether what we're doing will actually bring results.
Thank you, Veronica. I must say it's a question I continue to ask myself. I think part of it is I had two parents who were really raised me to be a person who questions authority. Even before the 60s, you know, that became question authority. My father, who was a Presbyterian minister and very middle class, sedate probably in many ways, but his favorite question was why? You know, when I was in high school at Lincoln High School here, where they had sororities, and I wanted to join because all my friends were joining, and my dad said, why do you want to do that? Just because everyone else is doing that? That's not a good enough reason. And then I had my mother, who was a kind of the feisty daughter of Scottish immigrants, who would argue with people, the old Myron Franks, about the price of things. Embarrassing as hell for me as a child. But, you know, she was fearless, and she was fearless on small things, you might say, that have to do with injustice around her two daughters. So that was kind of the seed, so to speak, which set me up to say, to raise questions. And I think that's so important, you know, which is something when I've taught, and I think Veronica is a superb teacher at Portland State, is to get people to question why. You know, if you just go through life saying, well, why is it this way? And then the follow-up question for me is, what can I do about it? My sister teases me that I feel like I can run the world, you know, and sometimes I do feel like I can do that. And I think, you know, that's a certain amount of hubris. Doesn't hurt to have a little hubris and confidence in yourself when you're tackling big issues. But I think the other thing, when I look at what sustained me, is family, friends, and for me, my faith. And the connection I made in Guatemala, working with radical nuns and priests who were very much influenced by liberation theology, and seeing, you might say, people who did not know how to read and write being taught through the Frere literacy method. And I thought, you know, if they can do this with overwhelming odds, I mean, I knew some of those odds, maybe they didn't, but I thought if they can do it, then damn it, Pat, you can go home to the United States and do something. Because it's really my inspiration that has guided my activism, is when I see people who, you might say, you don't expect to start the revolution, and they step up and they do something. and that has inspired me time and time again. The women I met in the detention center, facing incredible odds. And some of them I didn't read this. It's a chapter about one of the young women who I'm still in touch with, who didn't give up. And I think that's one of the things we can do as friends, family, community, whatever your community is, whether it's a solidarity community, whether it's a faith community, whether it's a labor union, is to just keep supporting each other and saying, go for it, Veronica, go for it, Pat, go for it, Deborah, go for it, Nan, and everybody will do their activism in a different way. Mine is heavily political and very influenced by my undergrad work as a political science major. And also because seeing the world through political eyes, in Nicaragua, and my friend Nancy Johns and her former partner spent a number of years in Nicaragua. They used to say, you read the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other. And that is a kind of a simple way of explaining what liberation theology is about. And it can apply to us here in the United States, So I don't know if that's a complete answer, but I see myself as a work in progress.
Thank you, Pat. And I think there are certain religious traditions, and I think the Jewish one might be one such tradition that it's really stuck with me. The orientation or the guidance is, you do not necessarily have to fix the world, but you have to account for the time you were given.
Right.
And I think the way you see the world, certainly you're accounting for all your time for as long as you can. And that is really, truly inspiring.
Well, I think, Veronica, in many ways, to use my privilege, I think those of us who are European American, white, whatever designation you want to say, have become increasingly aware in the last 2 or 3 years about white privilege. And I know it's kind of, some people would say, oh, it's so PC, Pat. But the fact is, I do have privilege. And I tried to use the book as well as the organizing work I've done, which is to invite people in as allies. And instead of the word solidarity, the word I really like is accompanimiento, is that, our sisters and brothers, not only in the South, but here, our siblings, invite us to join the journey for justice. And how can you say no to that? And I always say that my work on immigration is because when I went to Guatemala over 50 years ago, I did not speak a word of Spanish. I was hysterical to listen to as I tried to speak Spanish. And I was so warmly welcomed by this small indigenous community where we both spoke Spanish as a second language, which helped, frankly. But I think about that when I think about the ways we do not welcome the stranger or the newcomer to our society. We could have such a much more humane policy. And before you ask the question, I'm a big believer in open borders. Our immigration policy needs fixing, but I come from a stance of thinking that we should be free. If you think about how we, for the most part, up until the pandemic, could move back and forth to Canada, why can't we do that? Why can't Mexicans and people from Central America and South America? What is it that's keeping us with these incredible barriers?
Thank you, Pat. And I believe, Nan, you might be monitoring the chat. I'm taking a look here, and thank you, Deborah. The link for the book, the website where the book can be purchased, and you can read in more detail and at your own pace what Pat has experienced and the stories that she tells. It is very grounding. I don't know if anyone else has any questions they would like to ask or reflections they would like to share. Well, I'll give folks a few more minutes to think about what they might want to share. But Pat, I'm really struck by the story you told about being in the classroom with the 12 and 13-year-olds and drawing the map of Guatemala, Mexico, the United States, to demonstrate to students how borders change and how they evolve and the why of it. And I put that together with the question of the why, what grounds us, the why is it that way, and the importance of asking why. And I think asking why is such a powerful point of entry into conversation, especially with people who may not think like we do, or I do, or you do, given the work that we're doing. Because a why question is a consciousness raising question that can lead us into many places where more truth might lie, or more truth resides than the images or the knowledge we think we have. So I find that question about asking why, that sort of critical perspective on what we are experiencing, a very powerful one. And to that end, the students certainly in Guatemala had very direct and personal experience with the impact of US policy in Guatemala and how powerfully people, elites in Guatemala, had aligned themselves to get what they want in the society. And on your return in the United States, you clearly were working with other solidarity groups or like-minded groups to get the work done. I wonder how we might get that sort of consciousness raising in our elementary, middle, and high schools. How do we get in the curriculum, in our history books, in our current affairs social studies books, students and teachers asking that why question?
Well, you're in a position, Veronica, with the State Board of Higher Education to help with that, perhaps. I think there has been some movement. And I can't think there's a really interesting high school teacher in Portland who started a number of years ago, kind of rethinking history movement, and based on asking questions. I think, Veronica, actually, when you and I were involved with the Jubilee Global Economic Justice Movement, they did a whole thing on the global debt and what that means. I think that, if I understand correctly, the state of Oregon, at least, has made it a requirement to redo curriculum to look at racial justice issues. But I mean, the real issue is to tell the true histories of the people in the United States, whether that's labor union organizing, whether it's the feminist movement, the suffragette movement for vote. I mean, our history, I think that was the thing that struck me coming of age in the 60s, because my education in high school and college was pretty traditional, other than asking the why questions and who gets what, when, where, and how, etc. But, you know, it is telling and giving voice to all the various stories. I was really struck by what Pedro shared with us about our ignorance in 2022, when we look at, quote, farm workers or brown people, that they must all be Spanish speaking. And the fact, can you imagine being sent to a mental hospital, mental health, because you can't communicate? I mean, my God, you know. So it's like there's constant work to try to sensitize, which is one of the reasons, frankly, why I support Pedro Sosa and the Immigrant Rights Program, because he has this skill, because of who he is and his life experience, to hear and see that, and to be a voice at various tables to raise that. And, you know, years ago in Portland, I mean, in Oregon, during the height of kind of the farm worker organizing, which led to PCASC, Farm Workers Union here, there was a Colegio Cesar Chavez, you know, in Woodburn. And it was, you know, named after, obviously, the farm worker organized Cesar Chavez, but it was a college, a high school, a college set up to tell the history of Chicano people. You know, and we need more of these kinds of things. And some private schools, some charter schools, some schools have come about who have more freedom evidently in their curriculum, and perhaps parents who want their children exposed to this. But it is, when people ask me, well, what can I do? I think that's a really good, perhaps, to do, which is to get involved, go to school board meetings, you know, raise questions at your parent-teacher association, raise questions of principals, put pressure on the school boards, put pressure on the state school board to just say this is unacceptable. You cannot be educated in this world we live in. And if you don't understand your own history and the mistakes we've made, and yet sometimes inch by inch, some of the progress we've made. I think for anyone who has had the privilege of traveling outside the United States or who was born outside the United States, you get a very different picture of the United States. And I sometimes feel like maybe the best thing one could do is to take delegations constantly to other parts of the world to hear the stories directly. And PCASC can play a role in that in terms of, as you did with the previous speaker from El Salvador, who's written a book and talking about his experiences coming to the United States. Wherever we, and it's challenging right now in the pandemic to find places, and I'll just say to any of you listening, if you want me to make a presentation via Zoom, I'm happy to do that. Or
Thank
with
you.
anybody else.
Thank you, Pat. I do want to invite others to join in the conversation. I know, Pat, I do appreciate the wisdom or the guidance of having that people-to-people connection, taking US citizens to other parts of the world so they can actually see how other people live. I believe the Peace Corps and American citizens and young people who have had a Peace Corps experience tend to be very different citizens when they return to the United States. And I do think I think Jack's hand is raised. Jack, if you do have a question or an observation, please go ahead. Jack, were you wanting to comment or ask a question? Your hand is raised.
You can't hear me.
Now we can.
Okay. Yeah, it's staying with my sister in Northern California, and just on my life with neighbors. I mean, it's like they live in a different world. It's, you know, we've been taught the only thing that our life is here in the U.S. and it's in our consumer life, and that's it. And it just doesn't occur to people to be in community with it. It just, I think Pat must, by her witness, I mean, you show what it is to be one of us white privileged consumers here, and how your experience changes your perspective. And so I think that's very helpful. But I just feel, you know, I can talk about it, but nothing makes a difference, you know. I think, but I don't know what you can say in response, because I mean, you've been showing how you connect. I mean, I guess what I can do is tell my experience. Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No,
Just
that's
if
all right,
you're going to
Deborah.
say more, if you could just while you're talking, refrain from moving, because we're
Okay, right.
having some
Too much-
feedback with
yeah.
your sound.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. It's just I feel really frustrated, like Pat mentioned. I tend to climb up, you know, and or preach, and it doesn't work. And how to attract, I guess, show our connection into our ways of being, connect with, you know, being with people from, you know, Guatemalans and others, indigenous people, our commonality. But people are so set in their ways. It's just.
Mhm. I think Veronica is right in that schools and education and other groups that work with kids and after school things can also help expose people, to various perspectives. One of the things I wanted to say is also that, how do we expand our numbers? How do we get other people involved? A lot of it has to do with establishing personal relationships. I mean, one of the learnings from Guatemala and elsewhere is that if you don't have a trusting relationship, in Spanish it's confianza. If you don't have confianza, you can't accomplish anything. But with confianza, with trust relationships, you can accomplish a great deal. And so I think you're right, Jack. I could preach to the choir for a long time and nothing would change. But if you or I or anyone on this call can enter into a relationship of accompanying that person and establishing a trusted relationship, then sometimes there is more openness. We have an opportunity here. I'm very involved with the Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice. And a lot of us accompany people to courtroom hearings pre-pandemic. But there's, I think, an increasing opportunity, and obviously with the Afghans and Ukrainians who have a different kind of status than people coming from Central America and Haiti. But, people need support. I'm sorry Beth Ronk isn't on this call because I thought she might. Beth responded as Pedro was saying, to the wildfires in Clackamas County, and has an immigrant mutuality aid coalition that provides food every 2 weeks. They've done a lot of providing vaccinations against COVID, et cetera, but it's just like starting with where people are and getting involved and inviting others to get involved at their comfort level sometimes, and starting there. So I guess I want to ask for all of you who are on the call, it's just not me, but at all. What are your thoughts about some of the questions that Veronica raised? Do you have a differing perspective than what you've heard? This is really a conversation, not a lecture.
Just to kind of help people remember some of those questions that Veronica, in case you're like me on a Sunday morning and you kind of come in and out of your sharp work mind.
I think the question that I think we all constantly engage in, how do we maintain our energy and passion for this work? And how can we keep it going? And Pat talks about her whole life experience, and she is her variety of activists is one that becomes aware and sustains it over decades and keeps it going all the time. And now is wanting to pass on what she has learned, what she knows, in the interest of more people knowing. And so we're constantly asking ourselves, what can we do? And the wisdom I hear in Pat's response about what we can do, each of us find what sustains us. For Pat is that activism, that faith, that connection, that constant engagement. And Pat's advice, as she just said, is becoming connected in our community, do something. And what I think is really interesting when we think from a historical perspective, sometimes we despair that things have gotten so bad and no one is doing anything. But then we read later on, the Montgomery bus boycotts did not just start overnight.
Right.
People were having dinners in kitchens, small affairs. We only know the big story after it has happened. But when we're in it and we're doing little bits of it, it is hard for us to see the big picture. But the more we get involved in community, the more we learn, like this morning, the work that Pedro Sosa is doing and the AFSC is doing, it inspires us. It reminds us that it's at the grassroots we begin.
Mhm.
And we hope to see the payoff in the long run. But we cannot preemptively, we cannot ahead of time say, it is too big, it is too much, it is too depressing, therefore I won't do anything. That is when we lose. That is when it does not change.
If I can just give a very small example, and I said at the beginning, I thought about naming this book Resilience and Persistence. And those of you who know me well know I'm fairly persistent. And it's a strength. Maybe as annoying as hell sometimes, but it's a strength. When Veronica and I and others here in Portland were part of the Jubilee Global Debt Cancellation Movement, there was a piece of legislation when President Obama was still president, which would have led to a major debt cancellation by the United States of a number of countries around the world in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And we did a full court press with all our members of Congress, Oregon delegation. At that point, Senator Gordon Smith was the Republican senator. Some of us went to Washington, all of us had meetings, and I know Jack Herbert knows this very well in terms of Nan visiting members of Congress in their office here. And I got a call after a meeting with Senator Smith's aide saying, well, you know, Senator Smith thinks it's wonderful what you're doing, but we're going to decline. We're looking for co-sponsorship. And I said, you know, that's really interesting because Senator Smith has said that global poverty is one of his priorities, and this directly affects global poverty. I said, could you please tell the senator that he'll be hearing from us? And so what we did as our small core team is that we organized. We got every place we spoke in the next 2 months to sign a letter to Senator Smith asking him to be a co-sponsor, including Muslim Educational Trust, several of the Jewish synagogues, several other solidarity economic groups, some people from PSU. We just inundated Senator Smith's office with this is the right thing to do. A couple of days before Christmas, I get a call from this aide saying, I want you to know, Pat, that Senator Smith will sign on to be a co-sponsor. You know, woo, woo! You know, and we were the only state in the United States where our entire congressional delegation were original co-sponsors. Now, that's what I mean about celebrating the small and looking at the fact that you cannot be defeated by a no. To me, a no is an opportunity to organize.
Thank you for that, Pat. I think it is, as you talk about, do not take no. You know, we've seen movements, and sometimes we think that's the end of the movement, but movements tend to build over time, even when they seem like they've disappeared. We had the 99% movement, and then we had all that, mostly led by high school students, about gun violence policy in the United States. Then we had the massive movement following the killing of George Floyd and police violence. We had the Me Too movement. And it is big movements like that, the ability to move that many people does not come out of nowhere.
That's right.
It is from a refusal of people to say, you know, we're giving up, a refusal of people to say, okay, that's it. It's people who are saying, despite what the odds may look like now, we live in a democracy and it's people power that changes things. That's what changes things. People change things.
That is so true. And I feel that every time we get to meet with one of our congressional aides, they really appreciate our relationship. They listen to what we have to say. They don't always act on it, but we happen to have two very liberal senators and some really great Congress people, and hopefully we're going to get another couple of great Congress people, which I encourage everybody to get involved in those races too. We have Andrea Salinas running for the new congressional seat. And so that's very exciting. And also we have Jamie McLeod Skinner, who I'm just saying we have some opportunities to even increase our bandwidth in terms of liberal representation. But all that said, I feel like what's happening in PCASC is that we went, from a staffed organization to an all-volunteer one a few years ago, and unfortunately, that meant that a lot of the younger people dropped out because they were really being recruited by the young people who were leading the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And now people are seeing all of us, not all of us white-haired people, but a few of us leading the organization. And it really helps. I think this is so true of everything. It helps to see yourself, right? In whatever it is you're doing. Which reminds me of work at the border. And why did so many people jump down to Tijuana to help the Ukrainians?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it sounds like the place was packed with well-doers, helping them spend 12 hours in Tijuana and then get to cross over. And, Pat and I met at the border in Tijuana and 4 years ago. And we did not have an experience like that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I came home pretty shell-shocked from my week there. Yeah. Anyway, I think what we really need to do, and you've touched on a little bit, is the importance of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And in our case, collaborating with Emerge has been, when we do it, it's been very important. But yeah, keeping tentacles out there to really be able to bring in the younger people. We know that there's a lot of passion and a lot of activism in the younger people, and we want to bring some of that here. So,
Nan, one of the things that strikes me is that you might want to approach PSU about being a community partner to a capstone, because the senior capstones all are working really on issues of justice and equity. And if you locate a faculty member who would like to be the staff, the faculty to that, because that's really also kept me really excited in terms of working with the next generation and passing the baton. And so I'm happy to, off camera, et cetera, give you some contacts in terms of someone who might be a good fit for organizing a capstone with PCASC, which is another way of introducing young adults in the Portland metro area to the work that you're doing.
I don't want for us to I try to see the glass as half full, and I really try to focus on the good things that are happening. And I am incredibly inspired by the activism I see in younger generations of people, especially the youth, how far more open-minded they are on so many social issues in terms of being inclusive and how they're willing to fight back. And I think in any period, in any generation of time, it is the enthusiasm of youth, that sort of optimism, boundless energy of youth that often pushes us to do things differently. So I find it incredibly rewarding. They're what some of us might start to think of ourselves as the old guard doing this work, and see the new cohorts coming through to do this work. And when I think about it, and I think about all the resistance we seem to be getting at state legislation levels to critical race theory, understanding the world we live in, being more critical of what policies say and what the government says, what the federal government has done in our names, and we see that pushback. The pushback is an indication that some things are happening in schools that feel threatening to certain types of politicians. So at the same time that it's depressing that we have the pushback, because some schools are doing things very differently and more along the lines of what we would want. So it's also evidence that our society is changing. And we must remain hopeful.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, thank you, Veronica, very much for that. And I think that it's one of the things that attracts me to other activists who, for the most part, do approach it with the glass half full rather than half empty, because we need each other. And I'm also struck, Nan, by Pedro saying, how, can PCASC and AFSC have a serious conversation as to how some of what the work of the PCASC works with the immigrant rights projects, and maybe just lifting up and expanding through your network one of the specific issues that Pedro raised with us, and vice versa. Can Pedro think of ways that some of the people that he and others are working with can infuse some of the work of PCASC? So, I think collaboration, Portland and Oregon in particular are such a small community. After a while, you get to know every activist. So it's like, how do we combine and build on the power of those different activists in a collaborative way? And I don't think we need to keep going on. If we've reached a natural point, we can conclude, unless, Nan, you or Veronica have other things you want to particular say.
Pat, I think it would be remiss on our part if you didn't remind people, the process of, your book and how people can get a hold of it.
Sure.
And, say a few words about what's in it and what your hopes were for this book.
Well, I should start.
And one more thing, Pat. I just want to give the last couple minutes for anybody who wants to make an announcement, because there's a lot of activists in the room. So if you have things to share, we will close. We will ask you for that before we close.
I will be very short. The book is titled Choices, Death, Life, and Migration. And because I think choices is what people are facing. And it's available in English. It has also been translated by a colleague of mine into Spanish and published by a small indigenous press in Guatemala City. It's available through my website, which was put up on the chat, www.justiceactivist.com. Would you believe no one had that title for a website? And I'm happy to get the book out to you. I'm also happy to present. The proceeds go to the American Friends Service Committee Immigrant Rights Project. I didn't write the book to make money. I wrote the book to tell the story and to hopefully help an organization that I have a great deal of confidence in. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from some of you.
I just want to say thanks so much, Pat, and thank you, Veronica, for joining in the conversation. I found this really inspiring, and it's just always great to hear people's stories firsthand. And so thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And I'm going to get a copy of the book. I know that. And I'm going to ask you to autograph that.
Oh, yes.
Maybe we can do, well, there's
Maybe
always.
Maybe I can come to the picnic on the
That's
19th.
what I was going to say, but I didn't want to put you on the spot. So yeah, picnic, July 19th, the location to be announced. And that'll be an evening picnic because it's on a Tuesday and it's going to be a warm and gorgeous summer day.
And Pat, be sure to take bunches of books.
Okay, thank you, Nancy.
Anybody else want to make announcements?
I think I see Jack's hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, this reminds me what you folks have been saying about collaborating with each other. That what I see in Latin America are these broad, mass, popular movements, and look at our movements here. I mean, like the people who turn out, it's all one issue. People we tend to divide up into different categories, and none of us has enough people, enough power. But if we can approach it all as all one movement, we'd have a lot more, you know. And actually, the same people show up for Black Lives Matter and climate and so on. So I'm just encouraging ways to really frame things, to really be coming from, you know, we're working for a decent human life in harmony with our planet, and it doesn't matter what the subject is. And so but to not only immigration and where people came from, but the climate and the oppression of people in this country, all the different categories of people who aren't white privileged, etc. It's all one issue. So just encouraging us to keep broadening.
Thank you, Jack. I want to observe, Jack, on to your point about we tend to be single issue activists. I really appreciate the orientation that Jobs with Justice and Portland Jobs with Justice has. It's national, that we members actually signed pledges that they will show up throughout a year for 5 other activities of a group that's not their own. And it builds that sort of reciprocity. So when we need you, you show up for ours as well. I think this is an approach, just as, you know, AFC and this group, PCASC and, you know, PICUN, all these groups can sort of get into that reciprocity, solidarity arrangement. We will be there for each other when we need each other. Then I think we might be ready if we have announcements that need to be made. Pat, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. I'm just elevating my hand.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, any more announcements? And I just want to say thank you again, Pat, which I don't know if you mentioned that you injured your hand yesterday. So we are so appreciative that you were able to be here today. And sorry that you didn't have a whole lot of recovery time between.
Oh, me too. It was energizing and distracting, and I enjoy it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming and for hanging in there. And it's been a great brunch, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Nan. It was a joy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Thank
Veronica.
you, Veronica, Mom, Pat, and Nan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for doing it.
Good to see you, Connie.